I'll just stand here then.
Okay.
Not that your introduction will be lovely. too much pressure on me this morning. So we heard there's just a few more coming up, so I'll just wait.
Sure.
It's a few more minutes. Here they come. Most people will. I'm gonna bring that in, Camilla, and just.
Hi, Glenn.
Yeah, well, I think we might.
How about?
Yeah?
That would make that way.
Hello, good morning, Camilo.
Put one more chair in here.
Morning.
Good morning.
Good morning,
Everybody.
everybody.
Here, so you can see the slides.
Yeah, the lecture is easy to see. Everyone can do the video. He was the experiment. No.
Well, good morning again, everyone.
Good morning.
Good to see you in this new room, a new day. Our last day together.
I believe it's the last day.
I don't know what happened.
I don't know what happened.
I don't know what happened. So we have a few guests here tonight or today. Wow, I'm so asleep. Who are not in the Brazilian group. So could you please introduce yourself to our group here?
Yes, my name is Suki Fonalu. I teach here at school, and I was there for the Bossa Nova, and I dreamt about the girl from Ipanema.
You're one of us now.
Good. Yes.
I'm Taryn Holvik. I'm a third-year student in the counseling program. So,
Thank you.
glad to be here.
Welcome. Yeah, and then we have Saffron and Glenn who have joined us today as well. So very exciting. There was a little bit of a change in plans. I think Gwen, Gustavo's talk today is at 1 to 2.
Oh, I had it at 2.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's two talks today Gustavo's giving. One's from 1 o'clock to 2 o'clock, and one's from 2 o'clock to 3 o'clock. So you're welcome to come to either one of those, and Gustavo probably knows the classrooms they're going to be in, or you can ask Gwen.
I know where the 2 o'clock one is, but I will find out.
A and G.
Yeah, Mary from 1 to 2, and then Maria from 2 to 3.
Class A and then class G.
And then, of course, we have the really great opportunity at 3:45 for the book signing, the book reading and signing, and then we'll head out to dinner at one of our favorite places. So it's going to be a very memorable day. So I wanted to introduce you to Dr. Susan Rowland, who I have the pleasure to work with and create with. I was talking last night about Elizabeth Nelson and how creative she is and what an honor it is to work with such faculty, and feel the same way about Susan as well. Susan got her PhD from the University of Newcastle and her master's from the University of London and Oxford University. So we brought her over across the pond as well to be with us at Pacifica. She was the first chair of the International Association of Jungian Studies, the IAJS. Some of you may know from there. And then I saw some of you have her books, which is really exciting.
I teach two of my books to the Brazilian group.
Oh, that's very.
I don't have
very nice.
any more copies, but those two are for you guys to take away.
Good. Yeah. So I just wanted to mention a couple of. Susan's a very prolific scholar. So a few of her books, she's written on Jung literary theory and gender, the book C.G. Jung and literary theory, and then Jung, a feminist revision, and Jung as a writer, which is this yellow one here. She edited a book called Psyche and the Arts, and a book on C.G. Jung and the Humanities, and then the most recent book, The Eco-Critical Psyche, Literature, Complexity, Evolution, and Jung. So that gives you just sort of a sense of the range. And Susan also, I believe you're writing a book now on female characters in detective fiction?
Yes.
Yes.
I'm using archetypal psychology for the first time as a form of cultural criticism, and I'm looking at goddesses in detective fiction by women, American and British detective fiction. And I'm using, it's founded on the work of James Hillman, but I'm also making extensive use of Jeanette Paris's book, Pagan Meditations, and work by Christine Downing. And I'm behind schedule on a book on James Hillman and Jung and literary theory. But it's kind of happening as well.
Yes, it'd be very easy to be behind schedule if you're Susan, given everything that she does here on campus, the organizations and committees she's a part of, but also she's the chair of the Engaged Humanities and the Creative Life program. She's very involved in that program as well, and she teaches quite a bit in the Jungian and archetypal studies program as well. So she's a very beloved scholar and teacher, and just offer her to you now.
Oh, thank you very much. And thank you very much for coming. I don't know whose idea it was to make this a 3-hour session, but we will, I think it's very important that it's interactive. And I want to start by asking each of you a question about your use of Jung and gender. About, because I know that all of you are Jungians in one way or another.
I'm sorry, we are not. We are language teachers.
Well, that's what I was coming to that. I was coming to that, well, anyway. I wanted to ask each of you to tell me your names and to tell me how you kind of take Jung's Anima and Animus and the way he writes about Anima and Animus. Now, maybe you don't use Anima and Animus the way Jung wrote about it. Maybe you take Hillman's approach entirely. But I think it would be very interesting to know which of us are working with Jung's writings on Anima and Animus, because that's what we're going to look at this morning. And this would be true of people working in the humanities, whether you use Anima and Animus in the way that you work. So let's just go round, starting with you, Camilla.
My name is Camilo. I think that I didn't use Anima and Animus enough before I started studying Hillman to have a sense of something that I can define or something concrete. So, and because I began studying Hillman, that was even, today it's even more, I couldn't even, I know the definition, I know the concept, but I couldn't really say when I use it or not because I don't really think about it.
That's very interesting. Thank you.
Quer falar? Como é que você usa Anima?
Uso muito.
She uses a lot the concept.
Conceito, sim, consultório.
In her psychotherapy, as a psychotherapist, in her office. Okay.
Thank you.
All right, my name is Ana Maria. I'm an English teacher, so I'm not as familiar as you are with the terms in Jungian psychology. And I've just started studying him. And if Camilo, who is almost an expert in Jung, can use it, who am I to say that I use it? So I will skip.
Well, I'm her partner, so we've been together for quite a while.
Yeah.
But actually, I never thought about this in our, process of teaching or So I'm gonna pass. Maybe at the end
Well,
I might.
I think this is really interesting and useful, and it will give me a great context for what I'm going to show you. Thank you.
So good morning, my name is Fabiana and I'm a storyteller. So I'm not a psychotherapist, but I'm a Jung's reader and I'm a fan of him. And I use this, my job, my stories, so I present the characters.
Right. Good.
So
Thank you. Yes, and they are quite storytellers sometimes. These characters.
Good morning, my name is Ezekiel. I don't work with the idea of Anima and Animus, but I work with adolescents, juvenile delinquency. Most of them are male, 95%. And an interesting thing to think about, and my Animus, why these adolescents that are male so much, and why they are connected with violence. So I'm thinking now.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm Eliana. I'm a Portuguese literature teacher. I'm retired now from school, and I work with groups of women, groups of sharing. And I think that thinking about these metaphors, Anima and Animus as metaphors, helps me a lot to see what happens when we have women trying to work with their masculine side.
Thank you.
My name is George, and I think that Anima and Animus is most of the several representation about the soul. But so are opposite, masculine and feminine, but that's a symbol. I think that the phenomena is between Anima and Animus. That's what I think.
Right. Thank you very much. Glenn?
Well, as you know, I construct what you deconstruct. So I teach the classical theory in the DJA program, and Susan comes along, but hopefully what I do is plant the seed of deconstruction. So.
Thank you.
I'm Jennifer. I would be happy to go to an island where no one ever used the words anima and animus.
Well, I think we might be looking at why that might be so. Thank you, Jennifer.
Hi, I'm Gustavo. I'm a Jungian analyst.
Yes.
And I'm more on the side of Hillman's.
Yes.
And so I try to, I use them, I think with them, but I try to think with them more as archetypal lenses to, see through phenomena. Not too literally, like contrasexual imagination.
And I think then one of the questions is how much is how you see them as perspectives is affected by the way Jung wrote about them. And that's what we may come on to. Saffron.
I don't use those terms at all. I mean, I'm much more on the Hillman archetypal side, where I move for the specificity of the figure rather than the kind of conceptual ghost of an idea. So I don't use the terms ever.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Okay.
My name's Letitia. I am an analyst, and just like you, I don't use the terms. I don't like conceptualizations.
Yeah, the binary is a real problem, isn't it? When you think about real people, it doesn't kind of work.
Morning, my name is Rubens. I am an analyst too in consulting room. And I use and I don't use. That's to say, I think about Anima and Animus like notions that help me to understand both sides, the different sides of my unconscious. So more in the level of notions, no concept. notions.
Yes, I like that distinction. Yes, concepts can be very
Intellectual.
transcendent and concrete. Yes.
My name is Akasi. I'm analyst too, and I don't use the words anima and animus, but the notions like you said.
What's your name again? My husband is about the place too. That's very
The idea is present in my all day.
I'm Taryn. I'm so in the student learning phase. I'm not sure I even feel educated enough to, because I just listen to what other people say. But I've been exploring those concepts in my dreams and in my own work, and I haven't brought it into practice with my clients yet. But I'm really open to the concept of, you know, not necessarily men having to have an anima and women having an animus, but having it be a lot more blurred and merged. So kind of playing with those ideas.
Great.
And I'm Suki, and I have a long and complicated relationship with this problem. When I first started analysis, I would have dreams about these men that my analyst explained were animus figures, and I went through a series of work and openings that happened inside me with them in my dreams, and it was very important to me. But then when I started reading Jung, it started really kind of bothering me. There were a lot of things about these ideas as, you know, that these beings in my psyche had to be labeled this or that bothered me, just like labeling people bothers me. So then I tried to figure out, all right, well, the animus is always negative. And so I wrote about the positive animus, and I tried to figure it out that way. And I ended up feeling fairly bankrupt with the whole thing. And now I don't really use them in my practice. I just think of the beings in my psyche and my client's psyches as these imaginary figures that are actually really part of them.
Great. Well, I'm going to tell you where I am on this, and that's really where we're going today, this morning. And given that so much of this this visit and what we've been hearing about and studying is Jung and Hillman, I think James Hillman's revision of the Anima is terrific. And I really like the polytheistic psyche, and you know, it's obviously user friendly. However, I think that what Hillman did with gender, with the Anima in particular, avoids the problem that we see in Jung, the problem that we're going to look at. And that's okay. You know, there's a lot of reasons for avoiding problems, especially if you're basically in the world of therapy. But I'm not in the world of therapy. I'm in the world of humanities and literary studies in particular. And one of the principles that literary studies can bring to this debate is you don't avoid problems in the writing, that you have to take a piece of writing as a whole and you don't cut out the bits that you don't like. So there's that. Now, maybe that's not a very useful principle, but what I've come to realize is that the problems in Jung are also over Anima and Animus, which we'll look at in a second. I think they're also creative opportunities. So I'm going to suggest this morning that Jung's writings on Anima and Animus are like grit, and what we are called upon to do by the psyche, perhaps, is to make the pearl out of the grit. So let's have a look at the problems. I'm going to have to mess around with this a bit. Okay, right. Okay. So here's some of Jung's writings on gender. On the left, he's talking about eros and logos. I use eros and logos merely as conceptual aids to describe the fact that woman's consciousness is characterized more by the connective quality of eros than by the discrimination and cognition associated with logos. In men, eros, the function of relationship, is usually less developed than logos. In women, on the other hand, eros is an expression of their true nature, while their logos is often only a regrettable accident. There's the Jung we know and love. And it's very irritating. And it's very silly. But I'm actually coming to see the poetry in eros as an expression of their true nature. I mean, it's silly and it's overgeneralized, but if only we could find the true nature of women and the true nature of men. Here, on the other quotation is on the Animus. He's been talking about the Anima, and then he says, whereas the cloud of animosity surrounding the man is composed chiefly of sentimentality and resentment, that's your Anima, guys. In woman, it expresses itself in the form of opinionated views, interpretations and misconstructions, which all have the purpose, sometimes attained, of severing the relation between two human beings. By taking up a masculine profession, studying and working like a man, woman is doing something not wholly in accord with, if not directly injurious to, her feminine nature. The reason is that her animus, that is her masculine rationalism, assuredly not true reasonableness, has stopped up the approaches to her own feelings. Sorry about the mistyping there. So this is the way he writes about the animus and the way he writes about the psyche of women. Now, I want to go back to a particularly interesting example, which is this one. The anima has an erotic, emotional character, the animus a rationalizing one. Hence, most of what men say about feminine eroticism is derived from their own anima projections and distorted accordingly. On the other hand, the astonishing assumptions and fantasies that women make about men come from the activity of the animus, who produces an inexhaustible supply of illogical arguments and false explanations. Now that's a very interesting quotation because each sentence is coming from perspective, and of course perspective is something that you know a lot about. Who is speaking the third sentence? It's all in the writing. If you follow the logic of the writing, who is speaking the third sentence?
Jung's Anima.
Yes, it's the Anima, isn't it? I mean, I love this quote. You start with a kind of scientific, objective, this is what the Anima is, this is what the Animus is. You may not agree with him, but he just says the Anima has an erotic emotional character, the Animus a rationalizing one. Okay, fine, we can handle that sentence. We know where it's coming from. Then, hence most of what men say about feminine eroticism, then he says something that's really not bad. He says men are not objective about women. And I think many of the women here could agree with me on that. Men are not objective about women, just as women are not objective about men. Not wholly objective. We have our own psyches that get in the way. And then we get this animated sentence. So the question is this a trick? Is this a conscious trick or an unconscious trick on Jung's part? Because he's saying, you know, men can't be objective about women, and then he says a very unobjective and slightly unhinged point about women. The astonishing assumptions and fantasies that women make about men come from the activity of the Animus, who produces an inexhaustible supply of illogical arguments and false explanations. It's over the top, it's animated, it's the Animus speaking. But we don't know whether this is Jung kind of playing with us. So, you know, the men can't be objective about women because of their anima, and then so let's show them what it really looks like. The anima, he lets go and the anima takes over the pen. The question is, does he know he's doing that? Is it a kind of trickiness in the writing that is in the conscious mind of the author, or is it in the unconscious mind of the author? And I think this is an example of where you get more than one voice in Jung's writing. And there's a lot of this. Jung's writing is full of different voices. And it's not bad writing, as some people say, and it's not irrelevant. It's actually fantastically, crucially important to his psychology that you have these many voices in the writing. Here I suggest you have gendered voice. You have that kind of non-gendered, you know, I am really a scientist voice at the start. You then have a male voice situating itself as not being objective about women, and then you have a kind of crazy anima voice. And whether or not he was aware when he first wrote those sentences, he let them, you know, he let them stay in.
I have a feeling that Jung had a very specific relationship with Anima, which was entirely psychological. And when it became a more concrete reality, he had problems, or he was taken unconsciously by some other aspects.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right, and I think this is a very good example. But I think what we'll now do is kill Jung. Okay, we're going to kill Jung, and you may remember this, Camillo, from my class, because we're now going to do Death of the Author. Okay, so, and the reason why we want to do this is that this is an idea that is actually a very Jungian compatible idea. It is actually better to read Death of the Author than to read For the Author when we read Jung, because the two ideas are highly compatible. So we are taught when we read an author that we deeply respect, like C.G. Jung, like James Hillman, we are told to kind of read for the author's intention. So we say, and we say here, what does Jung really mean by this? Is he really intending to show us the anima, or is it just, you know, a slip of the pen and he doesn't know that he's showing us the anima? We read for the author because we have a fantasy that the whole meaning of a piece of writing is contained in the mind of the author. That writing is, you know, that we produce writing like little gods, and that the author is the god of the text. Now this is how we are taught to read for information, how we are taught to read for study, how we're taught to read to become Jungian analysts. But it's not natural, it is cultural. the idea of the author being the god of the text, being the source of meaning, the only source of meaning that counts. This is a very recent idea. It goes back to Romanticism, and this is where we start to see a connection with Jungian psychology. In Romanticism, which, as you know, was a movement in the arts and sciences in the 18th century, it also had a political dimension. Romanticism is certainly part of the generation of the United States, this idea of freedom and individuality and all that kind of thing. And one of the big things in Romanticism was this idea of the creativity of the imagination, which hadn't been thought about in quite this same way before. And in Romanticism, you get the idea that writing and art needs to be new each time, and that an author is creating a world anew. From Romanticism, we get this idea that art needs to be original and new and different and reinvent the rules every time. Prior to Romanticism, the idea of art being original would have been thought of as ludicrous. You know, art needed to be original. What mattered in a piece of writing was how far you were respecting the tradition. And that goes for literature, but it also goes for theology and psychology of the time and all the other things that ultimately go up to make Jungian psychology, that it was about, you know, adapting the tradition. But from Romanticism, we get this idea of the author as a kind of God figure, as the sole source of meaning in the text. What we need to notice now, and what is noticed in the 20th century when Rowland came up with this idea in 1968, is that this idea of the author as the god of the text is a monotheistic idea. Mm-hmm. So all the Hillman people here need to throw it out immediately, because it is a very monotheistic idea. And it's an idea that Jung is really having no truck with. To read for the author's intention is to be trapped in a monotheistic notion of meaning, that a text has a single meaning, and that meaning is going to come straight from the God that is the author and into our minds via a piece of writing. Well, writing doesn't work like that. We all know this. We all know that there are disputes about what different pieces of writing means. Americans know this because you have this thing called the Constitution, and you know that gets rewritten and disputed and argued about a lot of the time. So what we find in the 20th century is a move away from cultural monotheism, and Jungian psychology is a big part of that, because Jung begins the shift from the one of meaning in the psyche to the many, to archetypes as opposed to just one. Now, of course, Jung was very big on the self, and he does indeed take the self from Christianity, and he writes a lot about it. But he is nevertheless also an adherent of many archetypes, and you know, his attraction to alchemy kind of substantiates that. There's a basic question about Jung in terms of cultural theory is between structuralism and post-structuralism. Structuralism is the idea that there are fundamental structures to things. Post-structuralism says there are fundamental structures to things and they are unstable. And Jung kind of plays with both of these. Many Jungians treat Jung as a structuralist. A few treat Jung as a post-structuralist. I am very much on the post-structuralist side, but certainly both principles can be found in Jung's writings. This is both a structuralist moment and a post-structuralist moment. We have this, you know, we have these fundamental ideas. There is this femininity and it's like this, and there is this masculinity and it's like this. And then you have this complete deconstruction of the single voice. You have this other voice, this other gendered voice coming through. I'm going to take that back. No, I'm going forward. I want to go back. Sorry, I'm not very good with these. So this is what I'm arguing here. While on the one hand, Jung was an essentialist on gender, believing that male and female bodies bestowed unproblematic masculinity and femininity, respectively, his conservatism was undermined by his radical treatment of the unconscious. Jung's unconscious is sublime, it's the creative source, and it's the ultimate origin of meaning, feeling, and value. Therefore, his anima, conceptual, other to theory and banal, is supremely, in imaginative terms, Jung's figure for the mysteries we cannot master. Gender becomes a demand on the embodied imagination. Such a unique and experimental angle on gender is at once a treatment and a gaping wound in the writing. Jung faces two ways, as a powerful resource for ideas and as sorely in need of them himself. So that's really my position on Jung and the Anima and Animus, that, you know, there's all this kind of silliness and there's this wonderful kind of breaking down of these kind of claims to absolute truth about things. Any kind of questions or points so far? Incidentally, I see James Hillman as also a structuralist and a post-structuralist, perhaps more fluid than you.
Do you think there's a danger in making an attempt to see the good side of the authors instead of killing the author?
I think there's always a danger with power. And we're talking about power over and through meaning here. So I think what people were expressing when they were speaking about the Anima and the Animus was an unease with Jung's writings, because in many cultural settings they're presented as powerful. So if you have an analyst who kind of takes Jung's descriptions of Anima and Animus very literally, and then says, well, you know, all these strong opinions you have are clearly something that needs to be controlled because it's your Animus getting out of control. That's a problem. So there's a problem in making a god out of an author. There is, of course, a problem in going too far in the other direction and seeing all texts as incoherent, which is what the kind of extreme post-structuralists do. But when you get to someone like Derrida, he kind of acknowledges you actually can't do that and still be authentic. That we just cannot go into chaos because we as human beings don't work like that.
Right.
Here Lacan is useful, you know. So, and I'm going to bring in Lacan a little bit in a second. That this whole business of the symbolic order and its relationship to the real, that the symbolic order is a lot more fragile than we like to imagine, and there's good things in that fragility. Because creativity and perhaps the numinous come out of the fragility. So I'm suggesting that if we take Jung too seriously, we miss what is, in fact, something that is incredibly valuable in Jung, that hasn't really been sufficiently appreciated, and it's his animistic writing. You know, his anima writing is animistic writing.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on a little bit. So we've done that, and that's on the
You
same.
see that in the red book, don't you? Sorry.
Yes, you do. You do. The red book is really interesting. And of course, how we treat the Red Book as Jungians is, has kind of big issues. And I'm very opposed to Sonic introduction. Because I think it's creating a Genesis myth out of the Red Book in ways that is unimaginative. But it's a fantastic text, and it challenges the kind of assumptions that we make about what is psychology and what is art, and those are very good boundaries to challenge, and very good boundaries for Jungians to be involved in challenging. I think, because I think it really gives us an opportunity in the 21st century to be part of the kind of breakdown of paradigms between the sciences and the arts and humanities. And Red Book is right there, pulling it all apart. So what we have is oppositional concepts. Anima and Animus are described in oppositional terms. So are Eros and Logos. We saw an example of that. Within his writing, we have these banal stereotypes. The nagging woman as Anima, the nagging woman, the woman who's got too much Animus. The nagging woman just comes up again and again. But we also have what I'm calling here an embodied indeterminacy. What we saw in that quotation is the indeterminacy. We can't know whether Jung is deliberately giving us an example of animated writing or not. It's absolutely impossible to stabilize the meaning there in that way. So we have many voices in the writing, and I'm going to suggest that they have real potential for us. Okay. Now there is a particular quote which I'm going to show you, which is particularly difficult to handle. And because I wrote a book called Jung, a Feminist Revision, students assume that I'm a feminist. And they're not wrong, but it's an assumption that we actually don't have to make. It's perfectly possible to write a book on feminism without feeling that one is a feminist. So when they ask, they ask me, why are you a feminist? And I thought, well, shall I kind of prize apart that you're making that assumption because of the title? But I thought, no, I'll go to the real stuff. And the real stuff about why I would call my are two related statistics. That in England, 2 women a week are killed by their male partners. Mm-hmm. And also, of the rape cases that get to court, 90% are found not guilty. And I do believe that women are capable of lying about rape in the courtroom, but I don't think anybody believes that 90% of the men accused of rape in a courtroom are innocent. So there is a problem. There is a problem. And one of the problems is that that we seem to have reached a cultural point in Britain and America, and obviously I cannot speak for Brazil, where the endemic problem of violence against women has somehow been separated from discussions about feminism. And for people like me, white, middle-class, privileged women, the assumption is it's over. Feminism has done its job. We have equality. What are you making a fuss about? But it is still people like me who get killed and who get raped. And men get raped too, but men don't expect to get raped unless they're in prison, and that is part of the problem of rape. Whereas I think all women know they could be raped. That is something we face when we go out on the streets. And that is part of, that is the very dark side of gender, because there are still very kind of deep, we're not allowed to say this, assumptions in the population that men have the right to keep their women in order. And that is, that is something that is out there, and it's maybe less than it was 50 years ago, but it's still out there and it's still causing a problem. So we then get this quotation. No matter how friendly or obliging a woman's eros may be, no logic should be on earth can shake her if she's ridden by the Animus. Often the man has the feeling, and he's not altogether wrong, that only seduction or a beating or rape would have the necessary power of persuasion. So I think that's probably Jung's most controversial statement.
But Susan, don't you think it's a zeitgeist speaking? He is a man of his times. So he is Jung, but anyway, he is a Swiss man inside a patriarchal culture. So can't we think about the this context that may produce this, a collective animus that may produce this kind of discourse?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. He is a man of his times, and that's important, and that's part of the picture. But I think it's only part of the picture. We still have the problem of people who treat Jung's writings, all of Jung's writings, as, a kind of fundamental truth. And we also have the problem that when we read his writings, the writings are speaking to us now in the context of now. So although, we're talking ethics here, and we all talk about ethics when we teach students and writing, and I know analysts, are great ethicists. That part of the ethics is to treat Jung fairly as a man of his time, but it's also to say that there is a problem here. There is a problem here, and there is an opportunity, because actually I think this quotation is unreadable. I think we actually cannot read it in some of the ways in which it's possible to read it. It's so incendiary that we see these words and we think, this is, we can't deal with this. And so it's not dealt with. But actually, if we look at it and think, what exactly is this saying, then it's often not what it first appears to be saying.
What's really curious is that, I'm trying to imagine where Jung's mind is when he's writing this. And one of the things that comes up for me is that it's as if he's describing what he imagines is the case within many of the Greek mythic images of the female being pursued, overcome, taken by the male. And it's as if somehow he sees a truth in that dynamic and is trying to express a psychological knowing about what's being revealed in the mythic image. Because seduction, beating, or rape is what you see happen in many of the mythic dynamics between the male and the female. And so I wonder how much of this is, so I'm just putting that out there as maybe one way of trying to imagine how to read this.
Well, actually, I think you're perfectly right, Saffron. And I think one of the things that we miss if we don't grapple with this is the fact that he's right. A lot depends on wrong. He's not altogether wrong. Whether this means morally wrong or actually inaccurate. Now, if you read it as inaccurate, I think Jung is saying something unsayable, but true. That actually, when there are extremes of human emotion, particularly in fights between sexual partners, where you do get to the point where, pulling out a gun and shooting the partner seems to be the only way forward. And that is not something that is just happens to a few psychopaths. I think we're all capable of being in
Well,
this
they are
situation.
archetypal fantasies.
Yeah.
They are archetypal fantasies.
Yeah. Well, people commit murder all the time, and rape is quite common. And it is often used as a tool of power, of subduing someone, as opposed to, you know, a sexual relationship. So,
you know, Susan, it's so helpful to talk about this because this is the quote that always sends students over the top when they get to it in the reading. And but what it's touching on for me in relationship to where we've been is the slipperiness between inner and outer realities when Jung's talking about these things. And it's kind of curious the way you introduced this quote was to talk about a very stark outer social reality. And where the discussion seems to be going is towards underscoring the inner fantasy, even archetypal character of what he's getting at. Because you could argue, I wouldn't want to try to rationalize it for him, but you could argue that he's talking about an inner reality, that this is the feeling that sometimes gets generated.
you could argue that, and you know, the counter argument is well, why doesn't he actually say that? You know, this would be a far less difficult quotation if he simply said, now let's consider this archetypally and in fantasy terms, and I actually I want to prize away any kind of boundary between inner reality and outer reality here. I mean, partly because lots of people try and do that all the time, but also because most of us here, maybe all of us, have a teaching context. When I was teaching in London at the University of Greenwich, teaching a lot of undergraduates, one woman a term, you know, 20 years old, would come to me and talk about having been raped. And, you know, this was obviously a tiny proportion of the young women it was actually happening to. And in many cases, they were not my students. They just, and in some cases, they'd gone to the police. In some cases, they hadn't. In some cases, it was an ex-partner. In some cases, it wasn't. And they were completely, their lives were completely torn apart. I still get emails from some of them here, years later. Their lives are still kind of pretty wrecked. And I think we do have to, if we're talking about a teaching context, if we're talking about something outside the consulting room where this idea of inner reality is very firmly established, then I think we have to look at this in the bigger context. And my point is, it's actually the bigger context where it's useful, because we don't, as a society, acknowledge that the impulse to violence is pretty universal. It's just that, you know, 98% of us don't follow it through. And I think if we could acknowledge, I think what's helpful here is that it's intolerable, and it alerts us to the fact of the things that we cannot say, that we cannot discuss, that we do not discuss.
Susan, can I
Yes.
tell an experience, not of raping, thank God, but very close to me. And now you're telling this, and I'm understanding what happened at the time. But my husband was doing analysis with a very, very important and distinctive analyst. And one day he came home, and we were talking about sex or something. And he said, oh, my analyst told me that sex is rape. And I was surprised. And I didn't say anything. The analysis process had been disastrous at the time, so he's okay now, everything is all right. But I was completely scandalized. I listened to, I had to listen to this horror as an echo of his analysis process. So what you say is very true. It's very dangerous.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think that kind of points to the fact that, you know, we make these decisions, we make these divisions, and Jung is pointing to the point where there is that kind of, I mean, to put it in mythological terms, as you did, Saffron, is great. But Jung's actually putting it in everyday terms.
Right, absolutely. I agree with you, and I, you know, everything you're saying from the everyday terms, the outer life, I'm completely on the same page with you, as you know. And to me, that's the difficulty, or that's this highly creative tension point where I think feminism is still a really important perspective. Whereas how do we come to become more conscious of the complex yet distinct imaginal gender ideas and sexually embodied lived experiences as humans, and that they're somehow, they evoke one another and they cross over, and yet we have to become much more sophisticated in how we experience the inner and the outer. And so this almost even further highlights that sense for me, because both sides are absolutely incendiary.
Yes, yes, it is. And I mean, we're talking about inner and outer, and, you know, people have said, well, the fantasy. And, that, you know, these are the kind of categories that we work with. But I feel that what we can get from this, the pearl, from this grit, and it's very painful grit, is that there is a point where the word fantasy is it's a cop-out, because it's saying, you know, you're not really capable of beating somebody up or raping them or killing them, because I think Jung is pointing to the point where people lose the distinction between fantasy and reality. And I think part of being human is that many people, many of us will experience that point at some point in our lives. And most of us won't act on it. But, you know, I've been at a point where the only way forward in a relationship was to kill the guy. You know, and, you know, I didn't. This is why I'm in favour of gun control. Because I could only envision shooting him, and there were no guns available. But, you know, that is what life is like. That is why people murder the people they are closest to.
See, I think that's really important, because part of the phenomenology behind some of these writings is this state of possession.
Yes.
You know, that's one of Jung's concerns with this concept, is what happens when you get possessed by these archetypal figures, and then you're in a very different field, and in that state of possession, inner and outer are not differentiated. And so the spirit of what Jung is trying to do, at least one track that is on, is that careful differentiation. Make the situation more conscious.
Yeah, and this is really helpful, because I hadn't thought of it in terms of possession before, but yes, that's absolutely right.
So, well, it's sorry.
Okay, I will try to translate. The woman might have her animus constituted from the masculine principle of nature, out of the masculine patterns of the unconscious, collective unconscious, patterns that are experienced during her development, and also absorbed patterns that are absorbed, enacted from the animus of her own mother and women of her family. What I feel is a way to work in towards self-knowledge is reflecting over the quality of possessions of the animus, feelings of the animus, discriminating and observing its acting and what's underneath, what's underlying, coming to be its own logic thinking.
Eu trabalho no consultório, assim, porque o homem
Like she
posso
works in
ouvir
her office, like
uma mulher e a mulher posso ouvir o masculino,
that.
não atuar.
Yeah, the man can listen to. O homem pode ouvir o
Posso ouvir o sentimento, posso discriminar
and
também.
discriminate. Yeah, the feeling that whatever is being felt as coming from where, and if it's masculine or feminine, and the story, personal story.
Para poder sair da guerra.
So you can stop fighting and get out of the war.
Yes, yes. Well, absolutely. I mean, the ability to get back from this position into something else is supremely important. I really like the way she described the different aspects of the animus. I mean, one of the things I'm saying is that I think there is a value in these binarisms of Jung. And you mentioned the masculine principle, which I think is a term that Jung doesn't use, nor particularly the feminine principle. However, I think there are values in seeing a masculine and a feminine principle. And although Jung is pretty negative about the animus, the positive descriptions of the animus, the best ones I think are by Emma Jung, very much see the animus as a masculine spirit of nature. And of course we don't want to essentialize nature as the feminine in an essentialist way. Masculine spirit of nature, for me, the myth that I like in these terms is the myth of the green man. Have you come across the myth of the green man in Brazil?
Yeah.
It's in Europe, but it's also in Islamic countries. The green man is really a masculine nature spirit. He is in humanoid form, but he is a spirit of nature. You see the green man, and clearly it was part of pre-Christian religion in Europe. And in England, you see the green man as a kind of a face made of leaves. And you often see green man figures on churches because the churches were built on ancient religious sites of the animistic pre-Christian religion. And it comes into myths and stories quite a lot. There is a link with the green man and the Arthurian legends, King Arthur and his knights. Now I know that in Brazil this mythology of King Arthur is well known. In fact, in Psyche of the Arts there is a piece by a Brazilian author who is using Arthurian myth in the Brazilian classroom. And it's a very beautiful piece. Okay, well let's move on a bit from here. Yes.
I would like to remember The Fear of Feminine by Edmund.
Yes.
And I think that's we have to consider the brutality in both of dimensions, the masculine and feminine.
Yes.
So both are afraid of the other. So
That's,
we have brutality in feminine, brutality in masculine. The man make brutality with the women, and I think that's what you are trying to speak for us. But the reverse is true too, because the mermaid means the terrible of the sea, and we are afraid to be near, because we know that the fear of feminine. My Edmund is very interesting by this way to discuss this kind of stuff. I think
I think that's a really, really good point, and it reminds me that I'm working online in the Jungian Archetypal Studies program with a group of students, and that we're actually looking at a kind of Lacanian idea of the phallus, and one of the students has come up with the shark in Jaws, and then says, but it's rather a kind of feminine shape, the mouth with all the teeth. And so I introduced this idea of the fantasy of the vagina with teeth, and how that is a particularly terrifying image. The trouble is,
that was actually a solution that someone came up with for raping problems, I think in Africa or something. They came up with a condom that
with teeth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Right.
That you
But I want to keep. I think what I'm saying with Jung's writing is I want to keep this tension between Jung's own essentialism and our embodied life in the world, plus the imaginal realm or the fantasy dimension. So it is absolutely true that there is a fear of the feminine and a fear of the masculine. But it is not true that if we go out into the streets of Santa Barbara at night that we're all afraid in the same way.
Yeah.
Because, women are at risk physically in the world in the way that men aren't. And we have to kind of remember that is also part of the picture. And it's part of the picture when we read this from wherever we're reading it from.
Susan, what was this piece originally written in English?
I don't think so. It's the beginning of Volume 9, Part 2, Aeon, or Ion, however you pronounce it. It's, I mean,
I wonder what's that.
Yes.
He's talking about the shadow.
Oh, well,
Shadow.
translation. I was hoping to
You see,
not
we have
mention
that problem
translation.
a lot. That's why.
Yeah, I mean, translation is of course an issue, and it's part of the scholarship of Jung to look at issues of translation. And again with Jung, nothing is quite straightforward. He is totally tricky all of the time. So the trickiness with Jung and translation is that some things were written in German, some things were first written in English, some things were translated early on. And it says in the translation, this was translated in, say, 1925, and it was looked at by either Emma Jung or Dr. Jung. So, you have those wonderful kind of things with Jung, and the constant revision and all the rest of it. However, there is also the kind of bigger point, which is part of this death of the author thing, is that in a real sense, translation doesn't exist. Translation doesn't exist. Portuguese, English, mirror images? No. The languages are structured differently. There is a fantasy around the term translation in our culture that translation is possible, that languages are mirror images of each other, and that they do not change.
Yeah, that's why when you learn a new language, you don't really learn how to translate. If you know how to speak, you just know how to speak the language. You don't think
That's true.
your own language.
Yeah. I mean, there is a project to retranslate the collected works into English, on the grounds that somehow the original translation is inaccurate. And to me this is a fantasy, because first of all the languages have changed. So when Jung wrote German and German now, and when it was first translated to English and English now, it's changed. And Jung liked the English translation. He was around for most of it. So it's this fantasy that you can have the perfect truth, that you can have a direct line to the mind of C.G. Jung if you just get this somehow perfect translation, and there is no such thing. So I'm not saying that I don't care about translation, but I don't buy into a translation issue as the last word, because that is again erecting another monotheistic principle. This has been around as an English text for 50 years, and has been read by a lot of people and all the rest of it.
And just as a parallel thread, if you don't mind me throwing it in here, it's so interesting because this comes up with my students when we read the Homeric hymn to Demeter about Persephone's abduction. Some translations of the Homeric hymn say the rape of Persephone. Some say she was abducted. And so this language keeps moving and shifting. And the way that I have the students think about this is that it's like an archetypal field, and there's a constellation that's occurred around this action, but there are different words that are connected in order to understand the movement that occurred, but it keeps us from trying to pinpoint and hold on to this right way, of reading something, and so I just think that's really important.
Yeah, and I mean the archetypal field, this shows exactly the kind of coherence and the kind of cultural link between the whole project of Jungian archetypal psychology and these kind of big cultural issues of monotheism and animism, and how they are translated in cultural theory terms as structuralism and post-structuralism. So let's move on. Yeah, I don't really want to talk very much about Lacan, but this idea of the phallus is quite interesting to think about in terms of the anima. Incidentally, if you're getting desperate, I thought we'd have a break in a few minutes, so just hang on in there. Lacan is, of course, very important in the humanities and cultural theory, and so I'm introducing a little bit of Lacan onto the Jungian archetypal program. And for Lacan, the phallus, not the penis, but the phallus is the defining artifact, the sign of masculinity. Although Lacan sees the phallus not as masculinity as opposed to femininity, he actually argues that it is ungendered, but it is still the sign of power. Like Freud, Lacan regards the child's new position as gendered because boys are gifted by a patriarchal society with a privileged relation to the phallus as indication of social and sexual power. Yet neither boys nor girls actually wholly possess the phallus, since it becomes the ultimate sign of potency and completeness. A completeness forever lost in that tragic split from the primal mother. The splitting of the subject into ego and unconscious means that not even males can completely master the phallus for themselves. So we have a kind of feminine in the phallic symbolic order as somewhat less defined. And this kind of Medusa figure is interesting because Lacan, in his essay on the Poloing letter, which some of you may know, he talks about the Medusoid face of the signifier. He's talking about how language is castrating and reminding us that the phallus is also something that both controls and conceals the mother that can never be, who is terrible because she can never be re-entered. So just bearing that in mind, we get, if we think about Jung in this context of the symbolic order, this is where Jung starts to become really, really interesting for feminism. And it's a shame that more feminist psychological theory hasn't taken up Jung. Because with Jung, you get a symbolic order without the problems of the phallus. This is my argument anyway. So forgetting that Jung was not a big supporter of rights for women and women going into the workplace, as we saw from his somewhat dubious quotations about women going into work. But what he actually does is produce a way of understanding the generation of consciousness that doesn't have to privilege masculinity. The Jungian unconscious actively gives birth to the child's conscious ego. It means that the Jungian symbolic is primarily rooted in the struggles of the unconscious to create meaning through becoming embodied in an ego in the world. Those meaning-making principles that dwell in the unconscious Jung called archetypes. Anima and Animus are examples of their numinous and mysterious creativity. Most importantly, the Jungian unconscious is as capable of generating powerful feminine images of meaning as it is of producing masculine signifying. A society may inherit patriarchal motifs, but the individual possesses archetypal androgyny. Individuation inevitably challenges patriarchy. So this is the Jung that we can really make use of. And thinking of the work of people like Hélène Cixous and Lucy Rigore, they would, I think, find a Jungian foundation much more amenable to the project of re-signifying the divine feminine, or re-signifying gender in the divine as more plural. So that's okay. Any questions about that? However, there is also the way he writes about the anima. And basically, I think if we're using a comparison with Lacan, which we don't have to do, but it's often a nice way of trying to talk to people who know nothing about Jung but have been doing Lacan since they were 12 or something. On the one hand, we have a Jungian symbolic order which is significantly creative about gender, much more creative than anything from the Freudian tradition, I'm arguing. On the other hand, his anima is phallic, in the sense that it spoils, it threatens to inhibit the way we understand the feminine. And this is, by saying that, I'm really referring back to, the analyst who says, well, the anima is like this. And of course, what happens is that Jung writes about the anima, he writes about women, and basically there is this total slippage between the two. So that his portrayal of when he talks about the feminine, it can be the anima, it can be women. And there is no real sense that there's a kind of problem there, except, of course, with that trickiness that we saw earlier. So he oscillates between a kind of sublime sense of the anima, the soul, the creative unconscious, and all those possibilities that lie behind the anima for the male psyche. And this banal sense of the anima as inferiority, as the nagging woman. If you remember the anima as she first appears in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, this woman who is basically pointing him in the wrong direction and won't leave him alone and tells him that he's doing art, when he resists that notion, which is significant in itself. So what we get, for the anima proliferates beyond its assigned place as the concept of a male's feminine unconscious. We have seen how it spills over from object to subject, how it moves from the concept Jung is writing about to a voice assuming control of the writing. Additionally, the anima is Jung's frequent image for his most seminal idea, the generative unconscious. At times, the anima is the unconscious, not just one aspect of it. The banal inferiority that tends to colour this image for Jung becomes even more problematic when unconscious slippage in the writing slides from Anima to opinions about women. And, you know, that quote we looked at. Too often Jung will comment on women using the lineaments of his own inferior anima. For example, in what Jung admits is an ungrounded linking of eros and logos to the genders. Eros becomes the true nature of women, with their logos a regrettable accident. So eros is the true nature of the anima, but it's the true nature of women. And he says, you know, without actually having real kind of strong basis for saying that women, the psyche of women, the consciousness of women is dominated by eros. Their logos are a regrettable accident. You know, he says, I use these two as conceptual aids. Eros for the psyche of women, logos for the psyche of men. And then he goes into the whole business of the true nature of women is eros and their logos a regrettable accident. So what we really have is the anima basically congealing into a kind of phallus. Like Lacan on the phallus, to Jung, anima is what the masculine ambivalently has and what the feminine must be for the masculine. The anima-inspired feminine is too present in Jungian psychology. As signifier of the unconscious, she is the generative core of signifying, particularly of the gendered, erotic, unconscious, sublime positioning of the other. So I'm suggesting that one way of looking at the problems with the anima writing is that it that she becomes this overbearing figure, acting as a kind of phallus around which meanings are organised within Jung's work. That the anima is what the masculine needs the anima. He insists on this. You've got to find your anima. And that the feminine or the woman needs to be the anima for the man. Those are the terms in which Jung works. Even though at the same time you have got this wonderful androgynous, creative unconscious, and no real way of justifying what he's saying about anima and animus. Anima and animus cannot be simply the way he describes them. Why not? Why doesn't it work to say a woman's animus is her discriminating, rationalising function?
Because
and of course,
it's much more complex than that.
Because it's more complex than that.
Always, I mean, it's always.
It's as if he's never heard of individuation.
Yeah.
You know, these he writes about these. He gets stuck in his own ideas, and the whole business of Jung is it's about getting unstuck. You know, he has that wonderful opening of the essay on fairy tales where he says, "I am stuck," is what everybody says when they come into analysis. It is also the beginning of fairy tales and myth. All about getting unstuck, but the writing gets stuck in the depictions of the anima and animus. Even if there is a cultural truth that because of patriarchy and different cultures, you know, women are trained to be more relational and men are trained to be more discriminating. So there's some kind of vague cultural truth in that polarity. Individuation means it doesn't stay like that. Individuation means that anima and animus are dynamic principles.
How do you see this, though, in relation to the idea that Jung's whole psychology is a compensatory move on the cultural level? Therefore, it is, by definition, one-sided. So that, you know, you say the anima-inspired feminine is too present in Jungian psychology, but in a way, that was the task, to kind of bring that forth, to make the, you know, more central, more conscious. See what I'm saying?
I absolutely see what you're saying, Glenn, because I'm just coming to that.
Oh.
And I think this is a good point. That's the phallic anima images, you know, not very nice. Not very So, yeah, we're just coming to the fact that Jung's whole project is an attempt to rebalance the modern psyche. But I want to take a break
Yes.
because I think we all need some air, and British people need coffee breaks. So I need to be able to get some coffee. I think we should take a quarter of an hour's break. Is that okay with everyone? Great. We'll start again at 11:45. It's not a problem. I mean, this, whatever is being transmitted is clearly very rough.
Yeah, but it's 20 minutes. I got it timed. Yeah. It's really 18.
Punctuality is not one of the best characteristics of resilience.